Hey there, I'm Jonathan Cooper. I'm an animator at Naughty Dog, and today I'm going to be talking to you about interactive cinematic sequences in Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. So what are interactive cinematic sequences? Well, basically they're any time where we're in a unique moment in a level, in a game. It's neither gameplay nor it's a full cutscene. There's actually something for the player to do. Now we refer to these as in-game cinematics, although that's something of a misnomer now because all the cinematics are in-game. So from now on, I'm going to refer to them as IGCs. A little bit about my background. I've worked on a bunch of really big games, all to do with heavy on story, and typically I've worked in different roles of like cinematics or in-game, and usually they're quite separate. We have either gameplay or cutscenes. And Uncharted 4 was the first time I had the opportunity to kind of blend the two, and it's definitely something that Naughty Dog pushes, so it was a lot of fun. And essentially, I'm going to talk to you for the next half hour about how fun my job is. Currently, I'm finishing up the Uncharted The Lost Legacy. That's standalone. It's not a DLC, it's standalone. And it's these two lassies here are kicking ass, and they're definitely, I'm finishing up the finale action sequence, so it'll definitely give Nathan Drake a run for his money. So the talk is split into three parts. First, I'm going to go through my process, the way I typically set up a scene and get it all the way to finish. Then I'm going to go through a bunch of examples that we use, like various tricks and techniques that we use repeatedly throughout the game, although every scene is unique. And then I'm going to finish by doing a deep dive on our ETH demo. That was our Madagascar chase sequence, and that was definitely one of the most fun scenes to work on. So first off, process. Every scene has to be set up in Maya correctly, and then we're going to bring in props. I'm going to take you through the previs process, and that's a big process for figuring out a lot of issues with the scene as we're working with design. And then when we're ready for finishing that, we go to motion capture, and things can still change after that, but once we're good to go for the finish, we're just going to polish the crap out of it. So starting with my proverbial empty scene here, I'm going to bring in a character, and the first thing we drop in for every IGC is called an AP reference. That's essentially, it's short for action pack reference, and that allows every animation to be played relative to an object in the scene, relative to a place in the scene. It's how we essentially attach animations to moving objects as well. So there I've slapped on a pose on the character and brought in what we call an NDI camera, a Naughty Dog camera, which automatically gets exported with the player character's animation. And the way I like to set up my scenes is I create a pivot on the character so that I can rotate the camera around, and it behaves a lot like you would if you're rotating with the right thumbstick. Now, I don't start every scene from scratch. I have a bunch of prefabs, various different characters. Sometimes they have a Jeep in it. So here's Elena as well in this scene. And I'm going to drop in what we call the design block mesh. Now, this is still early on in the game. The designers are actually still building out the levels. So there I created a master mover that moves the entire scene over to the correct location. That allows us to move the scene because that happens a lot as we're still developing the game. So my first scene here is, the one I'm going to use as an example, is a simple going through a doorway. So in order to do that, I need a door. We have a full team that will actually build props for us, but for something simple like this, I'll actually use my crappy animation modeling skills to build a door, and as long as I give it a texture, like a color, and put the pivots of the objects in the correct place, we can run a process. We have a tool that will actually build the prop and put it into the game. So that's me just building it and then bringing it back into the scene. Now this is all ready to go and export into the game. The fun part is the actual prevising the animation. So we spent a long time figuring out how much animation is too much because we don't want to spend too much time on it. There's a high chance the scene will still be cut, but we don't want to also just have T-pose characters passing through a door because we playtest this and we want everyone to understand what's going on in the game. So you'll see I'm mostly just pasting poses, using the time slider at the bottom of the Maya scene there. I even mirror it across to Elena, just any kind of trick that we can use to save time and get this playable in the game as quick as possible. Finishing off with a camera pass there. And now I've set it up for export in the game. You see in the time slider at the bottom, We've actually chopped it up into an entrance, bashes, idles after a bash if you don't bash the triangle button, and then a success that we call that at the end. And now that would typically stay in the game for maybe several months, be playtest. A lot of changes might happen. Here I'm just moving on to the mocap stage. So once we're ready to go to mocap, we're actually going to start prepping before we even arrive. So we're further on. We've got a more finished environment there. And I'm bringing in a replica of one of our 2 mocap stages we have down at Sony Santa Monica. Now, this allows me to align our stage in the world, and then I can bring up the full inventory that we have down at Sony Santa Monica, and I'll be able to build certain props for the capture session. Now here, I'm keeping it simple. All I care about, I don't want doors. All I care about is where the doors are. And I'll be able to export the scene and bring it back up again when we're at the mocap stage. So here we are shooting that scene. See, we don't really use a prop there. I've got my 2 human doors. The guys at the stage have a much better idea of how to build the stages, so I tend to keep it quite loose and then let them build it afterwards. And you'll notice here that once they actually go through, we've added on an extra scene because we wanted an extra story beat to that door bash where Elena will fall and pick up a note and deliver some story to the player, to Nate. Now that happens a lot because we don't want to just keep adding IGCs. We'll take IGCs that already exist and then add to them, so that way we're combining things and making sure that as much story goes across as possible. So we'll get the mocap back the same day if I'm working late. Usually it's the next day. And we run a process, get it into our animation library here, and I'll make my selects of the mocap I want, and then typically just drop it into Maya and use their tracks editor that they have in order to sequence it. I'll line it up in the world. If it didn't do so with the stage, I'll make my loops. I'll do all my blends there, and that's just another quick pass. Allows us to get this in the game because this has got to be playable all the time. So I'll do a camera pass as well, and this is our more finished version, still with crappy props. And this would have gone over the course of a few weeks. So after that stage, if we're good to go, there's just going to be a ton of iteration. This is a quick snapshot of some of my version control here. It's a good reminder for animators to always put down notes for whenever they actually do check into the game, because oftentimes we're jumping back and forward based on changes. And at this point, I'm actually doing things like polishing up the face, adding facial, polishing up camera. We're doing camera depth of field, bringing in extra props, and just anything to bring that Naughty Dog level of polish to this final scene. So this is it with a much better environment. The doors are much better than my prop that I made earlier. And you see, we've added extra props in there to explain why the door needs to be bashed. This kind of thing happens all the time. We've got an extra props, a more finished skeleton there. Added facial. I ran a simulation on those books that fell over just to add a little extra visual polish. And I don't know if you noticed that Elena is actually on the other side. We found that actually worked better for this scene because she ends up on a door on the right. So here we've added to the scene further. We've added gestures onto the character. So Nate's eagerly listening. Elena's got an upper body gesture. She's explaining what's on the note. And working with design, we'll have her actually stand and stop in front of the door because we want her to finish reading her note before she hands it to you. The important thing is this is all in the player control, so the player can move around in the scene. We don't know where the player is, so we'll do things like this, a directional gesture on Elena, so she'll always be aiming the note out to you at the end. So that's kind of an example of a simple scene, a relatively simple scene that gets more complex over time, and that's kind of our process there. One of the other things that's really fun in my job, perhaps more fun, is actually coming up with ideas for some scenes that could be fun. This is using the same kind of animation technique of mostly pose-to-pose, but it's all exploratory previs to try and figure out what would be cool. How could we get these situations? Like here, I wanted to try this Indiana Jones style climbing under the truck. So what are the things that might push the player into that situation? Once there, what are some of the extra cool moves that you could perform? We ended up not going for this in the game because we didn't want to give the player the impression that they could take control of the truck by fighting the driver. But some things do make it, like jumping into the Jeep. So there's always something that you can take out of any kind of previs. And I'll show a lot more of that later. So that was the full scene process. That's essentially start to finish of a complete IGC. So I'll go through next some examples of some of the tricks that we'll use in order to get them, starting with like why we do a lot of unique scenes. You'll notice that if you play any Naughty Dog game, how we get things to align in the world and play animations on moving objects. Some of the gestures I mentioned earlier that we're playing on Nate and Elena, and some things that we commonly do to animations, blending between them and scrubbing them forward and backwards based on input. And last of all, Naughty Dog's trademark transitions in and out of IGCs and cinematics. So first off, unique scenes. Why do we keep doing unique scenes? Why do we make it difficult for ourselves? Well, when I first came to Naughty Dog, I came from mostly a gameplay background and was given a task of doing buddy boosts. That's essentially any time you boost your friend up to a higher ledge or they boost you. And we use it to kind of gate the player and also to separate them sometimes. So you'll see my initial pass was to just start doing all the gameplay animations I think it would require, different directions, different speeds, to build a system that we could use anywhere. However, I was warned that that's not the way Naughty Dog works. And they tried it before and it still doesn't work. The reason why, and this is what we ended up with 20 unique scenes for just buddy boosts. It's because you can see already we have different types of characters playing in the game at different points. We have completely unique backgrounds. And because we're always doing a level of polish where we're actually wanting all the finger touches and hand points, we can't just simply reuse the same animations. We also have like different props that they might jump up to. Here, although we standardized jumping up the ladders have to make sense in each world, so each part of the world. So therefore, we can't just simply reuse the animations. And sometimes the characters are even using props. And all the time, they're often talking to each other. So every single time that we have an IGC, it's an opportunity for some story to be told. Here, we'll even use it as a transition into cutscenes. So just all these different examples of why we can't do just one animation repeated, and why it's actually easier to have 20 different scenes that we're working on rather than trying to standardize things across the world. Another thing that comes up a lot, I mentioned it as the first thing that we actually drop into the world as our AP ref. Now you'll see I have 3 AP refs in this scene. These are the red crosses, and they're short for action pack. They're basically explain any animation in the game has to play relative to one of these points. So there are 3. There's one at the top of the hill here, there's one on the Jeep, and there's one on the player. And Uncharted 4 is the first game at Naughty Dog that was able to have multiple in one scene. So both the rock and the Jeep are playing relative to the one at the top of the hill there because they always play exactly the same. However, when we go into gameplay, we don't know where the Jeep is. So all the characters' animations are playing relative to the AP reference on the Jeep. That means they get exported relative to that origin position. And then lastly, we have one that moves with the character because we're actually got an animated camera there that's still playing as we start climbing out here. So we're giving control back to the player, and we don't know where they're going to be as we're blending out from that animation. So that's essentially something that we use all the time in order to get our characters touching the world correctly and moving with the correct objects. Here's a relatively simple scene where we're revealing a volcano. We take control of the camera, but we're not taking control of the Jeep. So the Jeep can still be driven by the player and rotated and twisted around. So for the gesture on Sam, when he stands up at the back, we actually create a directional gesture by animating the same thing 3 times and blending between them based on the Jeep's orientation relative to the volcano. Now we have other simple kind of gestures where Sully on the right here, he's just leaning out and checking things out. So he's a full body gesture that will take over all his gameplay animations, whereas Nate has a point, and we still want him to be driving underneath, playing his driving animations underneath. So we actually call that an additive partial, where I have an additive animation up his spine to have him lean forward, and then I have a partial on his head and his left arm to take over that, so that we always see that animation, but we still see on his right arm the underlying driving animations such as gear shifts and steering the wheel. So these are 3 examples of different kind of gestures we might have. Something we'll play with a lot is scrubbing animations forward and backwards. Here, it's any time you lift up an object or bash down a door usually. Here we're seeing as the player pushes forward on the stick, we're actually playing the animation forward, then we stop when they stop pushing on the stick. But it's not as simple as that. We'll also have IK on the hands, so whenever they stop, the hands go back up to the wall. When they stop as well, we'll play an additive idle animation on the player characters. And last of all, with scripting, we'll actually offset Sully and Nate there so that Sully looks like he's got a bit of a delay and it looks like he's reacting to the player moving through. Using that technique, we also go into, here's an example of a prop scene. Now, we don't always take control of the camera. Sometimes we're just animating the prop. So this is a simple, relatively simple prop that I've made with a spline rig inside it. And what we're doing as we're driving across this bridge is we're actually scrubbing the animation forward. If we turn around and drive back, we'll scrub it backwards as well. But like Sam's animation with three different animations in sync, we'll actually have a left version and a right version as well. And we're scrubbing all three of these in sync, and then we'll blend between the left and right versions if we drive to the left and right. So that's an example. It's just some of the detail we go to for just props as well. I said we have a full team that actually works on the props, and they'll take something like that from me, and then they'll just make it better. So here we've got physics on all the planks as well. So it's all about telling that story that they're driving across a very rickety old bridge. Now, the big thing that we do at Naughty Dog is transitioning in and out of cinematics, and one of our main techniques for getting that to work so smoothly is we actually record from the game and bring it back into Maya. So we can actually play the game and record it in, bring it into Maya. Here you'll see I'll push in the camera at a certain moment, so I can export just that section as an IGC. So this is an example of potentially when I climb over the wall, we have a camera that shows a reveal of what's over the wall. So I would just export that section and go back into the game, and that's a seamless IGC there. I'll also capture the before and after my IGCs once I've animated them to get my start and end poses and find out exactly where the animation hitches are. So we use that extensively throughout development. Here's another example of how we might work on, we don't want the characters to pathfind around objects all the time. So this in playtesting, this was a tree that can be approached from all angles because we found that oftentimes playtesters would run past and check out what was beyond and then find out they couldn't actually progress. So we actually created multiple AP references around the tree, and the character would just walk to the nearest one and then touch it from that side, as long as we made sure that the handle was touched, and we had IK to solve any issues of dodgy transitions. Now, this was also our first example of a new camera system that I know one of our leads, Jeremy, came up with, and he showed it at GDC. So this is a scene, like as we get closer to the interact point there, we're actually pushing the camera in into a preset camera that complements the start of this interactive scene here. And so we play through with the author camera, and then we come back into gameplay, and we go to another preset camera that benefits that scene, so we don't have like crazy crash cameras going in and out whenever we interact. You'll see as he walks away again, we're blending back out into gameplay cameras. So we ended up with around 30 different camera overlays that we could work with design to place at the start and end of our interactive scenes, anything that complemented the scene. And we'd also play them during full gameplay as well, so you had some kind of loose cinematography going over gameplay at the same time. We'd also do transitions in and out of cinematics, and because we had real-time cinematics, we could also, we didn't have to have any cuts. So here, I went to mocap and captured the start when he lands on the ground, and then blended it in Maya into this full cinematic here. We could only do that because we have real-time cinematics here. And we also had some cool tricks where, for example, if the player jumped to the left or right of this ledge, we'd slide the AP reference to the left or right, so that whenever he landed, we'd actually play the cinematic, or at least the first shot of the cinematic from that AP reference. Although we do still cut on some scenes, so it's perfectly okay to cut on a player-initiated action, like jumping down. We know that the player has to jump into that section there. We'll typically do that on vaulting over objects, or climbing over objects as well, because as long as the player has chosen to do it, then it's okay to have a camera cut. There's nothing worse than in a game walking down into a section and then just doing a random camera cut into a cutscene. So last of all, I'm going to do a deep dive on the E3 demo. This was our chase sequence that was one of the largest scenes that we created, and we did it first to figure out exactly how much work was going to be left on the project. That was one of the benefits of doing it. And I'll start with the concept and then the standard previs, the final stages, although I'll go over some of the prototypes that we created for this. So this was worked on for quite a few weeks before E3, maybe quite a few months. Finished up with some simulation there. So when I got onto the project, we only had a high-level description of what might happen at the story stage. It was essentially try to make it the best chase sequence we've ever had in an Uncharted game. And there were these two images, that one and this one, and basically everything else was up for grabs. So I started prevising. Oh, yeah, first off, let's look at the way it ended up. So with that, before we made all that, started prevising, just coming up with ideas. We knew a couple of loose things. We knew we were going to be hanging from a rope at some point. So what are some of the fun things that can happen with that? This is all very, very early, months before we even started on the demo. So figuring out it's not so much fun to have to dodge cars, but it is fun to smash through things. Here again, we're capturing stuff from the game, and that allows me to then go into IGC ideas that I might have. This IGC would have been awesome, but we ended up not going for it because we didn't want you to give away your grapple hook, just like we didn't want you to have the impression that you could take over the Jeeps. Although that would be awesome, we're always trying to figure out what makes best sense for the story. Here's a scene that definitely made it into the game, pretty much as is. And so, except I think the only difference was I initially had the Jeep sinking in mud, and we changed that to the Jeep being on fire, just so that the player has some kind of time pressure, and there's lots of iteration on each one of these things. So finishing up with getting chased on a bike, we knew we wanted that Terminator 2 kind of scene, and thinking what are some cool things you could do on a bike that you can't do on a Jeep or in a truck, and definitely we kept coming back to the idea of like going through small spaces and then having the truck smash through after you would be very awesome, very Terminator 2. So here I am, like spending more time on that, digging deeper into what could the cameras look like, how can we start getting that feeling of aggression, being chased by the truck at the end, and then finishing up with how do we eventually defeat it. And this was one of the last solutions we came up with, sliding under something. We ended up dialing this back a little bit because it was too Michael Bay. But other than that, a lot of this just had going into the game as is. So it was like we had 10 minutes of previs when we actually sat down to decide what we were going to do for the E3 demo. Next up, I started making prototypes. So here's a prototype of crowds. Now these are not NPCs, they're just actors, they're just props. And the same as the door earlier, except they look like humans. So it's a way an animator can start prototyping things. There's some tests with physical simulation. Wasn't ready for prime time there, but we did end up putting it on top of the entire climb system. And here's an example of a prototype of what the actual path might be during the chase. We're using the same spline system we used here as the final trucks in the game when you're actually jumping on trucks. But you can see at that kind of level, when the camera is that close, it's just not going to stand up. So a couple of weeks before E3, we actually baked, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, we baked the animation back into Maya and just keyframed the entire thing, splitting the work between myself and another animator who handled the bike and the rider, and I handled the truck, and the cameras, anything gameplay, and the aiming on Nate. So here is what that eventually looked like once it's had all the polish. You see Nate's actually got, so we've essentially got 1 minute of streaming animation that's playing for the sequence, and a minute of streaming animation on Nate aiming as well, with an additive pose to allow him to aim. We've got a whole bunch of animated destruction. The smaller pieces of destruction are done in real time. The larger objects are all animated. We've got a 30-degree window, essentially, that we can aim. And there we're actually scripting it to go back down to 0 when we push it through like narrow spaces, like the cargo container, also before the end. So it's just polishing this and adding destruction to get that feeling of being chased by this crazy truck. And then finishing with a seamless transition back into a cinematic. So a little on simulation. We used a lot of this for destruction throughout the entire project. And so I would use it for something like this. It's very hard to animate a car flipping and landing correctly. So just like mocap, I'm not going to try and get it exactly the way I like to final, sorry. I'm just going to actually run a simulation to get it in the air and get it as close as I can and then keyframe it from that point. So here you'll see my finished keyframe version of the flip. And again, I'm not actually going to use it to hit any of the objects there. It's very difficult to art direct destruction. So there I've got a box in the middle of the screen that's used to push over all the cargo containers. We're also sliding them out from underneath with the flatbed that you eventually slide underneath. And that's used a lot because we want to keep the scene very simple. We don't want the gameplay to be very difficult. And so this is very important to always include fail states into your action scenes. We have them for all our action scenes, but we don't want the player to see this. So we're trying to keep the gameplay simple. All they have to do is shoot. If they don't shoot, they'll end up seeing one of these sequences. But that's for that one guy that actually does try and break the game mostly. It's usually another game developer. So that's it. That's wrapping up pretty much everything. I've got a website on video game animation if you're interested in that in general. I like to just throw anything I can find up in there. I gave a Montreal Game Summit talk a while back on trying to get cinematography in games while still keeping it gameplay, so without cutscenes. So you can search my website for that, and the whole thing's written up there. And also, if you're interested in the design side of how we make some of these decisions for Uncharted and The Last of Us, as well as philosophies on how we create these scenes, then our two directors, Neil and Bruce, gave a great talk at GDC a while back called Creating the Active Cinematic Experience of Uncharted 2. And we still use a lot of those philosophies to this day on Uncharted 4 and everything going ahead.